The sound of the axe hitting empty air was the loneliest sound Maria Monroe had ever heard. Not the crack of steel splitting timber, not the satisfying thud of a clean cut, just the whistle of the blade through nothing, followed by the clang of iron against frozen ground, and the terrible silence of a woodpile that was no longer there. She stood in the blue-gray light of a Colorado morning in January of 1884, her breath coming out in rapid clouds, her dark eyes scanning the empty lot behind her workshop where yesterday there had been 12 cords of seasoned pine. Today there was nothing but boot prints in the snow and the deep ruts of wagon wheels heading east towards Silverton. Betrayal. The word arrived in her mind like a bullet she had not heard fired. Caldwell. It had to be Caldwell. She turned slowly, her jaw set so hard the tendons in her neck stood out like ropes under tanned skin. The workshop behind her, the one she had built with her own hands 3 years ago on the edge of the town of Ridgeline, Colorado, was already cold. The forge in the corner had gone dark. The shavings on the floor were frosted at the edges. Without timber, there would be no fire. Without fire, there would be no work. Without work, there would be no food, no lease payment on the land, and no future for the 12 families who depended on the furniture and structural beams she supplied every season. It was 12 below zero and dropping. She did not cry. Maria Monroe had not cried since the day her father's funeral pyre went dark in the autumn of 1881, and she was not about to start now. Instead, she did what her father had always told her to do when the world pressed down on you like a ceiling lowering. She looked up, and then she looked at the mountains. The San Juan range rose to the west like a wall of frozen gods, brutal and indifferent and enormous. Somewhere up in those peaks, buried under 3 feet of snow, was a secret she had been carrying for nearly 2 years. A secret her father had whispered to her during his last lucid week, gripping her wrist with hands that had spent 40 years working wood until the grain of the timber seemed to live in his skin. "There is a reserve," he had said. "Old-growth cedar and Douglas fir, pre-cut, aged to perfection. Your grandfather sealed the cache in the winter of '61. Painted the entrance stones with elk blood so the wood would dry true. Nobody knows it is there except you and me, Maria, and I will be gone by spring." He had been gone by November. She had not touched the reserve because it was a last resort, a hidden motive born from love and foresight, left like a buried treasure by a man who understood that the frontier could swallow everything you built in a single bad season. This was that season. But before she could think about the mountain, the sound of hooves coming up the main road pulled her attention back to the present moment, and the present moment was about to become significantly more complicated. The rider was big. Even from 50 yards, she could see that. He sat on a dark roan gelding with the easy confidence of a man who spent more time on horseback than on the ground, his shoulders broad under a canvas duster that was caked with trail dust and frozen at the hem. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind, and when he turned his head to look at the workshop, something in the angle of his jaw suggested he was a man who was accustomed to sizing up situations quickly and without sentiment. He slowed the roan as he approached, and when he looked down at her from the saddle, his eyes were the color of weathered oak, brown with flecks of amber, and sharper than she had expected. "You Maria Monroe?" he asked. His voice was low and direct, the kind of voice that came from years of giving orders outdoors. "I am," she said. She did not soften it with a question or a qualification. She had learned that habit from her father, too. He reached into the breast pocket of his duster and produced an envelope. "Name is Henry Hawkins. I ride freight and construction supply out of Durango. I had a contract with your mill for delivery of 12 cords of mixed pine and spruce. I was supposed to receive payment upon confirmation of your delivery." He paused. "Except the man I met at the East Road 2 miles back was driving 12 cords of mixed pine and spruce on a wagon headed away from this property, and he told me the contract had been renegotiated." Maria felt the cold in her chest deepen in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. What was the name of the man on the wagon? Didn't give one, but he had papers with a Caldwell mining stamp. There it was. The trap had been sprung. Josiah Caldwell was the wealthiest and most ruthless man in the San Juan basin. He owned the mine 3 miles north, the largest general store in Ridgeline, and had been trying to acquire Maria's workshop and the land it sat on for the better part of 2 years. She had refused every offer, every inducement, and every veiled threat. She had filed her land deed independently through the Territorial Land Office in Denver, personally riding the 2-day journey to ensure no local official loyal to Caldwell could interfere. She had been meticulous and she had been careful. But she had not anticipated that he would simply steal her winter timber supply. "The contract was not renegotiated," she said flatly. "It was stolen. The lumber on that wagon belongs to me, and the man driving it is either a thief or an employee of a thief." Henry Hawkins did not react with disbelief or condescension. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with those amber-flecked eyes. "That your workshop? Built it myself. And the timber lot is registered to your property?" "It is, along with everything that was on it this morning before 4 in the morning, which is when the tracks show the wagon came." He was quiet for a long moment, which she found unusual. Most men she had encountered in situations like this one either jumped to conclusion or jumped to action. Henry Hawkins seemed to be doing neither. He was thinking. "There is a law office in town," he said finally. "The town lawyer is Caldwell's cousin by marriage." Another pause. "County sheriff. Replaced last fall by a man Caldwell recommended to the county seat." She looked at him evenly. "You see the shape of my problem." For the first time, something shifted in his expression. It was not pity. It was something closer to recognition, the look of a man who understood what it meant to be cornered by forces larger than yourself and to stand your ground regardless. He swung down from the saddle with the fluid ease of long practice and tied the roan to her porch post without being invited. He stood at 6 feet 2 inches, she estimated, with hands that matched the rest of him, big and roughened and capable looking. "Show me your land deed," he said, "and tell me everything." She told him everything. Not out of desperation, but because her father had also taught her to recognize when a man's intentions were straight. And Henry Hawkins stood in her workshop doorway with his hat in his hands and listened without interrupting for 20 minutes straight, while she laid out the entire history of her conflict with Caldwell. She told him about the workshop, which she had established in Ridgeline in the spring of 1881, 6 months before her father passed. Thomas Monroe had been the finest woodworker in 3 territories, and he had taught his only child everything he knew, not because he had no son to teach, but because Maria had shown a gift for the craft at the age of 6 that he had recognized and cultivated with fierce pride. She had grown up surrounded by the smell of raw timber and wood shavings, had learned to read grain the way other children learn to read words, had developed an ear for the sound of a properly tensioned saw, and a nose for the difference between green wood and seasoned timber. By the time she was 24 years old, which was the age she stood at now, she could joint a board to a tolerance of 1/32 of an inch by hand, design load-bearing structural elements that would outlast any building in the territory, and operate every tool in the workshop from the spoke shave to the frame saw with the precision of someone who had spent 2 decades doing nothing else. She told Henry Hawkins about the contracts she had built, the school desks for the Ridgeline schoolhouse, the structural beams for the new hotel on Main Street, the cabinetry for 3 of the wealthiest homesteaders in the valley. She told him about the moment Caldwell had first approached her, 18 months ago, with an offer for the land that was so far below its value she had laughed, which had been the wrong response because it had insulted him deeply. She told him about the escalating pressure since then. The rumor campaign that tried to suggest her work was inferior. The attempt to have her land deed challenged on a technical filing error that the Denver office had ultimately dismissed. The broken window in the workshop last March that she had repaired herself the same afternoon it was broken. And now this. Henry Hawkins listened to all of it standing in the cold doorway, and when she was finished he said, You have enough timber to get through the week. I have enough timber to get through 3 days if I am very careful. And after that, she looked at him for a long moment, making a decision. The secret sat in her chest like a warm coal. She had not told another living person about the reserve cache. But the situation had changed, and she was too practical a woman to let pride endanger the 12 families depending on her work. After that, she said slowly, I have a plan, but I will need a strong back and a sled. He raised an eyebrow. You have somewhere to get timber. I might, she said, if what my father told me was true. What did your father tell you? She picked up her coat from the peg on the wall and her heavy wool scarf and her work gloves, and she said, I will tell you on the trail if you are coming. He did not hesitate. I am coming. That was the morning of January the 9th, 1884, 3 weeks before the worst blizzard to hit the San Juan basin in a decade, and it was the morning that changed everything. The story of how Maria Monroe and Henry Hawkins came to be on that mountain together really began, as most things in the San Juan basin began, with the land itself. The town of Ridgeline had been established in 1873 when silver was found in the mountains to the west, and it had grown with the reckless, optimistic speed of all mining towns, which meant it had grown badly. The streets were laid out with no particular plan. The buildings were thrown up in whatever order the lumber arrived, and the social order of the town was determined almost entirely by who had arrived earliest and taken the most. Josiah Caldwell had arrived very early indeed and taken a great deal. He was a tall, raw-boned man in his 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of surface manners that read as gentility until you looked closely at his eyes, which were always calculating, always measuring, always looking for advantage. He had made his first fortune in the silver mine and his second fortune in supply and transport, and he had developed the habit, common to men of his type and his era, of viewing any resource he wanted as something that was simply not yet his but would be. Maria Monroe's land sat at the mouth of a narrow canyon that opened onto the best timber stands in the valley. Whoever controlled that land controlled the most efficient route to the high country forest. Caldwell wanted the route. He had wanted it for years, and he had been frustrated for years by the fact that the woman who owned it was not for sale. Maria's father, Thomas Monroe, had chosen that particular plot with the eye of a man who understood both timber and geography. He had filed his claim before the town was formally incorporated, which meant his deed predated most of the official land records and was ironclad in a way that even Caldwell's purchased lawyers had not been able to undo. Thomas had also done something else, something that only became fully clear to Maria in the last weeks of his life. He had gone up into the high country in the winter of 1881 and spent 2 weeks in conditions that would have killed most men, and he had done something remarkable. He had located a forgotten timber cache that his own father, Maria's grandfather Ezra Monroe, had laid up in the canyon during the hard winter of 1861. When the first settlers in this part of the territory had run out of building material, and Ezra Monroe had ridden alone into the mountains to find a solution. Ezra had found old-growth timber on a protected south-facing slope, where a natural rock overhang kept the worst of the snow off the ground. He had cut and rough-shaped nearly 40 cords of Douglas fir and western red cedar, sealed it under canvas and weighted stones, and marked the entrance to the small canyon where it was stored with a pattern of red-painted stones that he had described in a letter to his son, Thomas, which Thomas had passed on verbally to Maria in his dying days. The cache had been sitting there for 23 years, which in lumber terms was an extraordinary thing. 23 years of aging in a dry, protected environment meant that the wood would be cured beyond any standard of seasoning available from a working mill. It would be dense, stable, virtually immune to warping or checking, and suited for the finest architectural and furniture work imaginable. When her father had described it to her, Maria had felt 2 things simultaneously. The first was grief, because a man dying of lung fever should not be worrying about timber reserves. The second was awe because she understood immediately what such a cache represented. She had asked him then, through tears she would not let fall, why he had not used it himself. "Because I always hoped I would not need it," Thomas Monroe had said, "and because I wanted you to have something in reserve when the world went wrong. The world always goes wrong eventually, Maria. The question is whether you have prepared for it." She had prepared for it. She had memorized the route descriptions he had given her, had checked them against the topographic surveys she knew from years of timber scouting in the high country, and had made the mental calculation that the cache, if it still existed and was still viable, would represent somewhere between 15 and 20 years of raw material for a workshop of her size. She had not told anyone, not because she was secretive by nature, but because she understood the danger. In a territory where Caldwell's reach extended into most corners of official life, a discovered timber reserve of that magnitude would be an immediate target. She had filed no supplementary land claim on the canyon, because any filing would have been visible and therefore vulnerable. She had simply waited, kept the secret, and continued to build her supply through normal winter season contracts. Now the normal winter season contracts had been stolen, and she was about to reveal the one thing she had sworn to keep hidden. The morning of January the 9th was clear and brutally cold. The thermometer on the workshop exterior read 14 below 0 Fahrenheit at 7 in the morning, and the sky was the particular hard blue that meant no weather coming but no warmth either. The snow on the ground was 2 feet deep in the valley and would be considerably deeper on the mountain. Maria spent 30 minutes preparing supplies while Henry Hawkins tended to his horse and then helped her hitch her mule, a large gray animal named Gideon who had the stoic patience characteristic of the best draft animals, to a flatbed sled with runners she had built and fitted herself from bent hickory. Henry watched her work without comment. He noticed, she could tell, the efficiency of her movements, the way she selected and loaded tools with the automatic precision of long habit, the way she packed the sled with rope and pulley equipment arranged for maximum accessibility rather than convenience. He did not offer to help with the technical packing, which she appreciated. He did help with the heavy lifting of the sled frame adjustment, which she also appreciated. "You built this sled?" he asked, running a hand along the curved runner joint. "Last winter. The bend is steam set over a hickory form. The joint is a double-keyed wedge, no nails, expands slightly in cold to tighten the grip." He looked up at her with an expression she had seen before on the faces of men who expected women's craftsmanship to be decorative rather than structural and found themselves correcting the assumption. "That is excellent work," he said, and his voice carried no trace of condescension. It was a plain statement. "I know," she said, without false modesty. "It will hold 600 pounds on a slope." She had also thought about Caldwell. He would know, once he discovered the timber was gone from her lot, and she had not collapsed into defeat, that she had resources he was unaware of. She needed to reach the cache, transport what she needed, and be back inside the canyon mouth before anyone connected to Caldwell became curious about her movements, which meant she needed to move fast, and she needed to trust the man walking beside Gideon's left flank. She had not yet fully made her decision about Henry Hawkins. He had arrived at a convenient moment and offered help with apparent sincerity, but she was not naive. Men who appeared at convenient moments sometimes had hidden motives. She said, as they cleared the last of the town buildings and started up the trail toward the canyon mouth, "You said you ride freight and construction supply out of Durango." "That is right." "Who do you ride it for?" "Myself. I have 3 wagons and 6 horses and a mule, and I hire out to whoever needs hauling done." "And who have you hauled for in this valley?" There was a beat of silence. "I hauled silver ore for Caldwell's operation last spring, 2 runs." She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to face her, and his expression was open and without defensiveness, which was either the mark of an honest man or a very good liar. "I stopped after the 2nd run," he said. His mine foreman shorted the agreed rate by $4 and told me I could take it to a judge if I did not like it. The nearest sympathetic judge is in Pueblo, which is 3 days' ride. I am not in the habit of riding 3 days to recover $4, but I am also not in the habit of working for a man who cheats on agreed terms. So you have a grievance with him. I have a professional disagreement with him. I do not have a personal one. I did not come to Ridgeline looking for trouble with Caldwell. He paused. But I came to Ridgeline with a contract that was apparently stolen, which makes me a party to this situation whether I choose it or not. She studied him for another moment. The cold was enormous and still, and the mountain rose above them both like a judgment. If you are working an angle, she said quietly, if there is a hidden motive behind the convenient timing of your arrival, I want you to know right now that I have been dealing with Josiah Caldwell's machinations for 2 years, and I am very good at recognizing a trap. He met her eyes without blinking. I am not working an angle, he said. I am a man who had a contract stolen and met a woman who had her timber stolen on the same morning, and those two facts seem like they belong to the same story. I am willing to help you because the situation is wrong and because I can, not because I expect anything from it. She turned back to the trail and started walking again. Good, she said. Then keep up. The canyon entrance was 2 miles from the workshop, up a switchback trail that Maria knew as well as the lines on her own hands. She had walked it dozens of times in the 3 years she had been operating, scouting timber, and testing the quality of the high country stands for future contracts. She knew every turning, every hazard, every place where the trail narrowed dangerously or where snowpack could slide. Henry Hawkins was a good mountain walker. She noticed this with something approaching pleasure. He did not rush and did not lag. He read the terrain ahead of him rather than watching his feet, and he handled Gideon's lead rope with the competent ease of a man who had spent a great deal of time with draft animals. He asked no unnecessary questions and made no unnecessary sounds, which she appreciated more than she expected to. She began, slowly and with careful selection, to tell him about the reserve. She explained who her grandfather was and what he had done in the winter of 1861. She explained the conditions of the cache as her father had described them. She explained the painted stones and the route markers. She did not explain what the discovery of such a cache would mean in material terms, because he would understand that himself when he saw it. He listened with the same focused attention he had given her earlier account of Caldwell's campaign, and when she finished he said, "Your grandfather sealed 40 cords of timber in 1861, and nobody found it in 23 years. The canyon is not on any surveyed trail. It is a secondary feature off the main drainage, and the entrance is obscured by a rockfall that probably happened in the 1870s. My father found it by following Ezra's written directions, which he had kept in a letter box since boyhood. And you memorized the route. My father described it to me 4 times over 3 evenings. I have a very good memory." He was quiet for a moment. "What if the cache is gone, or damaged? Then I have a different problem than the one I have now," she said. "But I have to find out." The trail narrowed at the canyon entrance, squeezing between 2 rock faces that rose 40 feet on either side, and the shadow between them was so deep and cold it felt like stepping into the interior of a mountain. The snow here was undisturbed, which was important. No wagon had come through recently, no large party of riders. She followed the main canyon for a 1/4 mile, then turned left at a distinctive split boulder formation that her father had described as looking like a man with 2 heads, which it did, if you had a sufficient imagination. The secondary drainage was tighter, barely wide enough for the sled, and Maria felt the familiar tension of navigating a space with equipment where the margins were uncomfortably small. Henry was behind her, managing Gideon and the sled through the narrow passage without complaint or incident. She heard the runners scrape once on a submerged rock and heard him speak a quiet, soothing word to Gideon when the mule stiffened, and the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. The painted stones were there. They were half buried in snowpack, but the pattern her father had described was unmistakable, a rough arc of 7 stones with a flat capstone in the center, and the faded remnant of the ochre-red paint her grandfather had used was still visible on the protected underside of the capstone where the snow had not reached. Maria stood and looked at the stones for a long moment. 23 years. Her grandfather had placed these stones when her father was a young man in his 20s, when the war back east was just beginning, when this territory was barely mapped. He had stood in this cold canyon in a winter she could only imagine and marked this place against a future need he could not see specifically but could feel as clearly as the cold on his face. She blinked. She was not going to cry. She had established this clearly. "This is it," she said. Henry looked at the stones, then at the canyon wall ahead of them. "Where is the entrance?" She counted 12 paces from the capstone, due west, as her father had told her. The canyon wall at that point was a jumble of frost-heaved boulders and weathered scree, and at first it looked like solid rock. But when she swept snow away from the base of the largest boulder with the pine bough brush she had brought for exactly this purpose, she found what she was looking for: a gap. Low and narrow, barely 3 feet high, but it went through. Henry crouched beside her and looked in. "Your grandfather went through there. He was smaller than you," she said. "I will go first." She went first. She had to remove her coat to get her shoulders through, which she did with rapid efficiency and no drama, pulling the coat through behind her. On the other side of the boulders was not a crack in the rock but a fully enclosed space, a natural alcove in the canyon wall perhaps 30 feet deep and 20 feet wide, where the rock roof curved over in an almost perfect arch. And in that alcove, stacked with the systematic precision of a man who had built his whole life around the proper treatment of timber, were the cords of Douglas fir and western red cedar that Ezra Monroe had laid up in the winter of 1861. The canvas covering had rotted in places over 23 years, but beneath it the stacks were intact. The timber had been elevated off the ground on cross rails, another mark of professional understanding, so that ground moisture had never touched the wood. The natural air circulation of the alcove, fed by the same gap through which she had entered, had kept the wood dry through all the seasons. She put her hand on the nearest board. Even through her work gloves she could feel the density of it, the solid, inert weight of fully cured old-growth Douglas fir, wood that had grown for perhaps 200 years before her grandfather cut it, and then cured for another 23. It was extraordinary. It was the best timber she had ever touched. Henry's head appeared in the gap, and then with considerably more difficulty than she had managed, his shoulders and then the rest of him. He stood up, pulled a match from his pocket, struck it on the rock, and looked at what the small light illuminated. The silence that followed was the best silence Maria Monroe had ever heard. When the match burned down to his fingers, he did not curse or flinch. He simply stood in the dark for a moment and said, very quietly, "Your grandfather was a remarkable man." "He was," she agreed. "So was my father." "And what does this represent?" He asked it with the tone of a man who already had a sense of the answer but wanted to hear it said clearly. 23 years of fully aged primary timber, Douglas fir for structural work, red cedar for fine furniture and cabinetry. At the yield rates for my workshop, somewhere between 15 and 20 years of raw material, depending on waste and project complexity. In the dark she heard him exhale. "Caldwell has no idea this is here. Nobody does, except you." Another silence. She felt the weight of what she had just done, giving this knowledge to a man she had met that morning, and she felt simultaneously certain that it was right and terrified that she had made a catastrophic mistake. "How much can the sled carry per run?" he asked. 600 pounds. "I want to take 3 runs today if the light holds." "And where will you stage it once we get it back?" She had thought about this. "The workshop floor has a cellar space beneath it that I use for tool storage. It is not large, but it is concealed. What I bring down from here I will restack below floor level until I can use it. Anyone who comes to check on my situation will find an apparently empty workshop." He was nodding in the dark. She could hear it in his next words. "And Caldwell will expect you to collapse within the week." He will expect me to come to him hat in hand or to pack and leave. He will get neither. Henry Hawkins struck another match. In its brief light she saw his face, and something in his expression in that moment, some combination of recognition and deep respect, stayed with her for the rest of the day and well beyond. "Tell me how you want to load the sled," he said, "and let us get to work." They worked for the next 7 hours without stopping except to water Gideon and eat the bread and hard cheese Maria had packed. The loading was precise work requiring both technical knowledge and raw physical effort, and Henry Hawkins gave her both. He was enormously strong, she noticed, but he was also careful. He did not manhandle the timber or stack it quickly and carelessly. He watched how she placed each piece and matched her method, and after the first 20 minutes he was loading his side of the sled with the same systematic efficiency as hers. On the first run back down the canyon, Gideon pulling the laden sled and both of them walking alongside, she told him more about the wood. She explained the difference between the fir and the cedar, the grain patterns to look for, the way aged timber would take finish differently from fresh cut, the structural properties that made Douglas fir ideal for load-bearing elements and red cedar ideal for exposed surfaces. She talked about it the way most people talked about things they loved, which was to say she talked about it with a depth and specificity that assumed the listener was capable of following, and did not simplify. He followed. He asked questions that revealed genuine understanding. He had done enough construction supply work, it became clear, to know something about timber beyond the commercial basics, and that knowledge allowed the conversation to become a real one rather than a tutorial. By the time they made the third run in the early afternoon, with the winter sun already sinking toward the western peaks and the temperature dropping again, they had moved nearly 1,800 pounds of prime-aged timber from the alcove to the workshop cellar, and they were talking about Maria's grandfather with the ease of people who had known each other for considerably longer than a single day. She learned about Henry as they worked. Not because he volunteered information easily, he did not, but because she asked direct questions and he respected directness enough to answer them. He was 31 years old, raised on a cattle ranch in eastern New Mexico, the eldest of 4 brothers. His father had died when he was 19, leaving the ranch in debt, and Henry had spent the better part of a decade working every kind of frontier labor, cattle driving, mine work, road construction, before settling into freight and supply work because it suited his combination of organizational ability and comfort with physical hardship. He had come to the San Juan basin 8 months ago following a supply contract that had expanded into several more, and he had been operating out of Durango since then, with the vague intention of eventually putting together enough capital to buy a small spread somewhere and settle. He had no specific plan for the settling beyond the acquisition of land and the construction of a livelihood on it. He had no family waiting for him, no woman promised, no obligations pulling him in any direction except forward. He said all of this without self-pity or romanticism, as a simple statement of fact about his current position in the world, and she found herself liking the honesty of it. The cold was severe by the time they had the third load into the cellar and the trap door closed over it. Maria straightened her back against a protest from her muscles that she acknowledged and dismissed and looked at the workshop around her. The forge was cold. She needed to start it. She needed to eat something hot and she needed to think about tomorrow. "I have a cook stove that will take split pine," she said. "I have enough small wood for the evening and the night. If you have no urgent business in Durango, I would appreciate another day's hauling tomorrow." Henry Hawkins looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not immediately read. "I have no urgent business anywhere," he said, "and I would like to see this through." "I will pay you the standard day rate for hauling," she said immediately. "Whatever you charge for a full day's work. You do not have to do that." "I pay for labor," she said firmly. "I do not accept favors from men I have just met. It creates obligations I do not want and you would not want to be owed." He was quiet for a moment, and then he almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, more a shift at the corner of his mouth that suggested one was available if the situation called for it. "Fair enough," he said. "Standard rate." She cooked that evening on the small iron cookstove in the corner of the workshop, using the last of her small wood, and producing a pot of salt pork and beans that was simple and hot, and exactly what both of them needed. Henry had brought supplies from his own saddlebags, including a slab of cornbread wrapped in cloth and a small bag of ground coffee, and these additions transformed the meal from survival into something approaching comfort. They ate at her workbench, seated on stools on opposite sides, and the oil lamp between them cast the warm golden light that oil lamps produce, which is the most forgiving light in the world. She told him about the projects she had in progress. The contracted school furniture, 12 desks, and a set of shelves, that was due in March. The structural beams for the new hotel addition that were already shaped and waiting for the builder. A commission from a wealthy rancher named Guthrie for a complete bedroom set, which was the most complex piece of furniture work she had taken on, and the one she was most excited about. He asked questions about each project with what appeared to be genuine interest. The hotel beams interested him particularly, because he understood load-bearing architecture from his construction hauling work, and could ask technical questions she had to think about properly to answer. "The span is 32 feet, she said, drawing the beam geometry on the back of a supply list with a carpenter's pencil. "The challenge is the lateral thrust on the outer walls, because the builder wants a minimal wall thickness for window placement. I am proposing a king-post truss configuration that transfers the load to a central compression post rather than pushing out against the walls." He studied the sketch for a long moment. "Have you built a truss system before?" "3 times. One for the Guthrie barn, one for the schoolhouse roof, one for a warehouse south of town. All 3 are still standing without settling." He looked up from the sketch with that expression again, the one she had seen at the cash entrance, the one that had stayed with her. There was something in it that was not just professional respect. There was something personal in it, something warmer, something that she noticed and filed away without knowing exactly what to do with it. "Maria," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, "what you are doing up in that canyon and what you are planning for this workshop is extraordinary. I want you to know that I understand that." She put down her pencil. "Most people in this town think a woman running a woodworking operation is a curiosity at best and a problem at worst. Most people in this town are wrong." She looked at him across the lamp. The workshop was warm now, the stove doing its job, and the smell of pine shavings and machine oil was around them like something familiar and right. "Thank you," she said. She said it quietly and meant it completely. That was the first evening. The next 4 days had the quality of a particular kind of intense experience, the kind that compresses time and deepens connection faster than years of ordinary living can manage. They rose before dawn each morning, worked the canyon trail in the hard cold, moved timber with the systematic focus of 2 people who were both, it turned out, genuinely excellent at sustained physical labor organized around a clear purpose. But it was not just the labor. Between the runs, while Gideon rested, they talked. They talked about everything. About the territory and its politics, about the injustice of the land grab era that was stripping homesteaders of claims they had built their lives on, about the particular cruelty of a system where men like Caldwell could purchase the legal apparatus that was supposed to protect against men like Caldwell. They talked about her work. She showed him, on the second evening, the pieces she was currently building. She sat at her workbench and showed him how she read the grain of a board before making a cut, moving her fingertips along the surface with a sensitivity he found remarkable to watch. She showed him the difference between a ripping cut and a cross cut, the way the saw moved through wood differently depending on the direction of the fibers, and why the difference mattered for the final product. He had never seen anyone explain craftsmanship with such clarity and intelligence. He was a competent man in many physical skills, but he did not have this kind of deep technical mastery in any single domain, and he found himself watching her hands at the workbench with something close to reverence. On the third day, she let him try jointing a board by hand. She set him up with the bench plane and showed him the stance and the stroke, and he tried it with the confident approach of a physically capable man and produced, predictably, a board with a slight belly in the middle. "Too much pressure in the middle of the stroke," she said, standing at his shoulder. "You need to concentrate the force at the toe on the push-off and at the heel on the follow-through. Feel the plane want to tip at each end and resist it." He tried again. Better. Again. He tried 6 times, and on the 6th try the board came off the bench with a flat surface that was within acceptable tolerance, and he knew it before she said it because he could feel the difference in the resistance. "There," she said, and there was something in her voice when she said it that was almost maternal and almost something else entirely. He set the plane down and turned to look at her. She was 3 inches shorter than him, which meant she had been looking up at him slightly all week, but the physical hierarchy implied by that geometry was completely reversed by the reality of their situation, and both of them knew it. "You have been teaching me since the first morning," he said. "Every time you explain a process, you are giving me something." She blinked. "I explain things because I enjoy explaining things. I'm not keeping score." "I know you are not," he said. "I am." The 4th day brought trouble. She saw it as soon as they came out of the canyon in the afternoon with the last sled load of the week's haul. 2 horses tied at the workshop post, and a man sitting on her porch steps who had the look of official business and the stamp of Caldwell's organization. She stopped the sled and said to Henry quietly, "Leave the talking to me." He nodded without argument. The man on the steps was Caldwell's ranch manager, a lean and cold-eyed individual named Pratt who carried himself with the specific arrogance of a man who does violence on behalf of someone else, and has been protected by that relationship for long enough to forget what exposure feels like. "Miss Monroe," he said, standing and touching his hat with elaborate courtesy that was the social equivalent of a sneer. "Mr. Caldwell sends his regards." "Mr. Caldwell can keep them," she said pleasantly. "What do you want, Mr. Pratt?" Pratt looked at the timber on the sled with an expression that shifted from casual to calculating in a way she had seen before. He was noting the quantity, the quality, the direction they had come from. "Mr. Caldwell is aware that your winter supply has run into some difficulties," Pratt said. "He wanted me to convey his concern and his offer to purchase the property and workshop at what he considers a very fair market price, given your current situation." "My current situation," she said, "is that I am unloading a timber delivery and you are in my way. The offer, whatever it is refused." "You have not heard the number." "The number does not matter. The land is not for sale." Pratt's eyes moved from her to Henry and back. "And who is this?" "This is my business associate," she said, without elaborating. Pratt looked at Henry for a long, measuring moment. Henry stood with his arms at his sides and his expression utterly neutral and said nothing. "Mr. Caldwell will be disappointed," Pratt said finally. "I expect he will," Maria agreed. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pratt." Pratt left. She watched him go with her arms crossed and her expression giving nothing away, and when the sound of his horse's hooves had faded, she turned back to the sled and began to unload. Henry came to the other end of a beam and lifted it in tandem with her. He saw the timber. He did. "He will report back that you have material you should not have. He will. And Caldwell will try to find out where it came from." "He will." They worked in silence for a moment. Then he said, "We need to seal the canyon entrance better. If he sends someone to scout." She looked at him sideways. "That is exactly what I was thinking." The next morning, instead of hauling timber, they spent 4 hours at the canyon entrance making the secondary drainage trail as uninviting and invisible as possible. They swept the sled tracks with pine boughs, scattered snow to cover the worn path, and piled brush across the entrance to the secondary canyon in a way that was natural enough to look accidental and dense enough to discourage casual investigation. It was intricate, thoughtful work, and they did it in near-perfect coordination, each reading the landscape and the other's movements with the easy synchrony of people who have worked together long enough to develop a shared vocabulary of attention. When they were finished and standing back to assess the result, Henry said, "You have done this kind of concealment work before." "My father taught me," she said. "He said that in the territory, the things worth keeping were worth hiding well." Wise man. "The wisest I have known." She paused. "Until recently." She did not look at him when she said it, and he did not look at her. But she felt the words land in the cold air between them and stay there. It was during the second week, when the timber operation was well established and the immediate crisis of supply had been addressed, that the nature of Henry Hawkins's presence in Ridgeline began to shift from functional to something less easily categorized. He had sent word to Durango by the weekly post rider that he was engaged in an extended local contract and would be unavailable for other hauling work for the foreseeable future. He had arranged for his team and wagons in Durango to be managed by a reliable man he trusted, and he had settled himself with Gideon in the small stable at the edge of town that served the commercial district. He began to spend his evenings at the workshop. Not every evening, not intrusively, but with the natural regularity of a man who found that a particular place and a particular person's company were better than the alternative. He brought coffee and sometimes cornbread. She provided the workspace and the conversation. They settled into a pattern that was comfortable and charged simultaneously, like a piece of timber under tension, stable until the force exceeded the tolerance. She was working on the bedroom commission one evening, shaping the headboard panel from a piece of cedar she had selected from the alcove cache with the care of a jeweler choosing a stone. The wood was extraordinary, the grain tight, and even the color a warm reddish-brown that would deepen beautifully with a linseed oil finish. She was using a cabinet scraper on the surface, a thin piece of tool steel bent to a subtle curve, drawing it across the wood in long, controlled strokes that produced thin, translucent shavings rather than dust. Henry was across the workshop, mending a crack in the sled runner with a wooden wedge and hide glue, doing it exactly as she had shown him 2 days earlier. She could hear the tap of the mallet, measured and patient. "Henry," she said without looking up. "Maria, why did you not go back to Durango after the first week?" The tapping stopped. She continued scraping, listening to the cedar give off its clean, sharp scent under the steel. "Because the situation is not resolved," he said. "Caldwell is a problem I have been managing for 2 years. I am capable of continuing to manage it." "I know you are." "Then why?" Another pause. The fire in the stove ticked quietly. Gideon shifted in his stall outside with a sound like distant thunder. "Because I do not want to leave," Henry said. It was said simply and without drama, but it was the most honest sentence she had heard from any person in longer than she could immediately calculate. She set down the scraper and looked at her hands, which were sure and steady and gave nothing away. She thought about the shape of what she was feeling, which she had been circling for days without allowing herself to name it directly. She thought about the cold mornings on the canyon trail and the lamplit evenings at the workbench, and the way he had said her name the first time, and the look on his face at the cache entrance. She was not a woman who approached the territory of feeling carelessly. She had watched her mother lose herself to grief after her father's death, and she had made a private and serious decision to never be that kind of lost. She had guarded her independence with the same precision she applied to her craft, measuring every potential relationship against the risk of losing the self she had built. But precision also meant the ability to recognize when a thing was genuine. "Henry," she said. "Maria, I need you to understand something about me before we go further in any direction." She did pick up the scraper now and turned to face him across the workshop. "This operation, this workshop, this land, this work, it is not a thing I do. It is a thing I am. I will not become smaller for anyone, and I will not share it out of obligation or sentiment. If someone is part of my life, they are part of it because they genuinely belong here, not because I am lonely or afraid or in need of rescue." He was watching her with full attention, the mallet still in his hand. "I understand that," he said. "Do you?" "I think," he said carefully, "that the part of you that built this workshop from the ground up and memorized a route to a hidden timber cache and refused to sell to a man who has every official resource in this county in his pocket, that part of you is the reason I want to stay. Not despite it, because of it." She stood with the cabinet scraper in her hand and looked at him for a long moment, and something in the structure of the wall she maintained shifted very slightly, the way a well-made joint shifts under exactly the right amount of force, not breaking but settling into a new configuration. "That is a very well-constructed sentence," she said at last. The corner of his mouth moved. "I have had some time to work on it." She turned back to the cedar panel. "Finish the sled runner," she said. "The glue will set crooked if you leave it at this stage." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the warmth in his voice when he said it was a new thing entirely. Caldwell made his next move 10 days into February. He could not have known about the cash, but he had clearly concluded that Maria Monroe had resources she should not have, and his response was the response of a man who was accustomed to winning through institutional force. He filed a claim with the county land office alleging that Maria's deed contained an imprecision in the boundary survey that placed the workshop itself outside her registered land, and sought an injunction requiring her to cease operations pending a resurvey. The injunction was delivered by the county sheriff's deputy on a Tuesday morning, while Maria was planing beams in the workshop, and Henry was hauling the finished school furniture to the schoolhouse on the sled. She read it carefully, read it again, and set it on the workbench with the precision of someone placing a tool they intend to pick up again. Then she went to the locked chest under her workbench where she kept her important documents, and she took out the original land deed filed in Denver in the spring of 1881, the correspondence from the Denver Territorial Land Office confirming the accuracy of the survey, and a personal letter from the survey engineer who had conducted the original boundary measurement, in which he certified the exact coordinates of all 4 corners of her property to within 1/10 of an acre. She also took out the route survey she had commissioned privately and confidentially from a different surveying firm the previous year, which confirmed that the secondary canyon and the alcove within it, while not part of her registered land, sat on territory that was officially unregistered and therefore subject to first claim filing. She had not filed the claim on the canyon because filing would have been visible, but the alternative claim Caldwell was making gave her a reason to act. Henry came back from the school delivery to find her writing at the workbench with focused urgency, surrounded by documents. "What has happened?" he said. She told him. She showed him the injunction and the counter-documents she was assembling. He read through the injunction with the careful attention of a man who was not a lawyer but understood the architecture of official malfeasance. "He is claiming the survey was misregistered." "He is," she said, "but I have the original survey engineer's certification, and I am going to file a new affidavit with the Denver Land Office by the Thursday Post Rider before any local official can interfere. The Denver filing will take 2 weeks to process. 3 in winter," she agreed, "but it will hold. The injunction is an intimidation tactic. If I respond quickly and correctly, he loses the leverage." Henry set down the papers. "You know land law. My father spent 6 months reading the Colorado Territorial Land Code before he filed his original deed. He insisted I read the same material before I filed for this workshop registration." She looked up from her writing. "He said the land was the foundation, and a foundation built on ignorance would fail." She paused. "He was right about most things." Henry was looking at her with that expression again. It was becoming familiar to her now, and she had stopped being able to pretend that it did not affect her. "What can I do?" he asked. "I need a witness signature on the affidavit, someone who has no registered relationship with either party." "I have no registered relationship with either party," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I am asking you." He signed where she indicated in a firm and even hand, and she sealed the envelope and addressed it to the senior registrar at the Denver Territorial Land Office. The Thursday Post rider would take it out of Ridgeline the next morning. Then she sat back on her stool and rubbed the bridge of her nose with her thumb and forefinger, and for the first time in the 2 weeks she had known Henry Hawkins, she allowed herself to look tired. He noticed immediately. He had been noticing everything she did. She was aware, with an attention that was not surveillance but something more like the way a good craftsman observes good work, learning the patterns, appreciating the execution. He put a pot on the cook stove without asking, and she heard the clink of the coffee grounds going in, and she closed her eyes for a moment and thought about everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks and what was still ahead. "Maria," he said, from across the workshop. "I am all right," she said, before he could frame whatever he was going to say. "I know you are," he said. "I just wanted to tell you that I think what you are doing is remarkable. The way you planned for this, the reserve cash, the surveying documentation, the Denver filings. You have been 2 steps ahead of him the whole time." She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling of the workshop, which she had built herself from good pine planking, and thought about her father and her grandfather and the particular kind of intelligence that is not academic but practical and deep. "I have been afraid the whole time," she said. "I just do not let it stop me." He brought her the coffee and sat on the stool across the workbench from her, and for a while they were quiet together in the workshop. And the quiet was not the silence of 2 strangers but the silence of 2 people who had found, unexpectedly, the specific person they fit best beside. The Denver affidavit worked, as she had known it would. The reply came back in 3 weeks, confirming the original survey certification and dismissing the boundary imprecision claim on the basis of the engineer's documentation. Caldwell's injunction died before it could be formally heard. He tried twice more in the spring. Once through a rumor campaign that she had obtained her timber supply through illegal means, which she addressed publicly by inviting the 3 most respected homesteaders in the valley to tour her workshop and examine her supply chain documentation. Once through an offer to her largest client, the hotel builder, of cheaper lumber supply if he moved his contract away from her, which the hotel builder refused because he had seen her structural work and trusted it in a way he did not trust cheaper alternatives. By March, the school furniture was delivered and installed. The hotel beams were raised and the truss system performed exactly as she had designed. The bedroom commission for the Guthrie Ranch came out of the workshop in mid-March and was universally agreed to be the finest piece of furniture work the valley had ever seen. A headboard of western red cedar with carved panel insets that caught the light like something alive. Old man Guthrie, who was 65 and weather-hardened and did not give compliments casually, stood in his bedroom and looked at the installation for a full minute, and then turned to Maria and said, with the particular deliberateness of a man who means every word, "This will outlast my grandchildren." She drove the supply wagon back to the workshop with Henry riding alongside on the roan, and the afternoon sun was on the mountains, and the first signs of the high country thaw were beginning in the south-facing slopes, and she was aware of a feeling of such settled rightness about the day that it surprised her with its force. "He said it will outlast his grandchildren," Henry said. "Douglas fir structural members in a dry climate will last 300 years if they are properly maintained," she said. "The cedar panels will take some care, but 200 is reasonable." He looked at her with a combination of amusement and admiration that she had come to recognize as one of his primary expressions when she said things like this. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Only that most people would have enjoyed the compliment without calculating the engineering." "I enjoyed the compliment," she said, "and then I calculated the engineering. Both things are true simultaneously." He laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, and she found she liked the sound of it quite a lot. That evening in the workshop, with the first week of real spring warmth coming through the open door and the smell of thaw and pine mixing in the air, Henry Hawkins told her something he had been working toward for a while. "I have been thinking about what comes next for me," he said. She was fitting a drawer in a cabinet she was building on spec, testing the slide with the careful attention she gave every fit. "And I have enough capital set aside to buy a small piece of land. Not much, but enough for a start. He paused. There is a plot a mile east of town that came available last month. Good soil, good water access, not too far from the timber country. A man could build something on it. She did not look up from the drawer. A man could, she agreed. I have been wondering, he said, what that man's life might look like in this particular valley, whether the things he values might have room to exist here alongside the things that already exist here. She set the drawer on the bench and turned to look at him. He was sitting on the stool across the workbench, and he was looking at her with a directness that matched her own. Henry, she said. Maria, he said. You are the best person I have worked beside in my life, she said. You are honest and capable, and you have never once in 3 months suggested that I am less than what I am. You have never tried to manage me or soften the edges of my work or make me smaller to fit a shape you prefer, and that is not a small thing. That is, in my experience, a rare thing. He did not speak. I am also, she continued, aware that I have been looking for reasons to tell you things since the first morning, not because I needed to tell someone, but because I wanted to tell you specifically, and that is a new experience for me. He got up from the stool and came around the workbench and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him with the cabinet scraper still in her hand and the workshop around them and the spring evening through the open door. I love you, he said. I want to say that plainly because I think you appreciate plain speaking. She set down the scraper. I do appreciate plain speaking, she said. I love you too. I have been less plain about it because I was checking the tolerance. And the tolerance. It is good, she said. Very good. He took her face in both his hands, those large, roughened, capable hands that had moved so much timber and mended so much equipment, and learned to follow her direction so naturally. And he kissed her in the workshop with the evening light coming in and the cedar smell around them. And it was exactly as right as the best-fitted joint she had ever made. Josiah Caldwell left Ridgeline in the early summer of 1884. The specific circumstances of his departure were the result of a combination of forces that had been building for some time. The Territorial Land Office, responding to the pattern of complaints and appeals that had accumulated against his operation, had opened an informal inquiry into his land acquisition practices. The hotel owner, whose structural work Maria had completed, had become friendly with a territorial newspaper correspondent who was interested in stories about mining interests corrupting local government. And the county sheriff who had replaced the previous one at Caldwell's recommendation had, under questioning from a county commissioner who had his own grievances with Caldwell, quietly confirmed several details about the stolen timber delivery that made the situation untenable. No formal charges were ever filed. This was not justice in any complete sense, and Maria knew it. Men of Caldwell's wealth and connections rarely faced formal accountability in the territory, and the injustice of that was real, and she did not pretend otherwise. But he left, and his departure meant the Canyon Trail was no longer under surveillance, and the workshop land was no longer under threat, and the families of Ridgeline who had depended on her work could depend on it without fear of interference. On the morning he left, she stood at the workshop door and watched his carriage go up the main road with no particular expression on her face. Henry stood beside her. Satisfied, he asked. Partially, she said. It should have been a formal reckoning. It should have. But the workshop is safe. The land is safe. The families who depend on this work are safe. She paused. I will take partial satisfaction and keep working. He put his arm around her shoulders, which he had been doing for several weeks now with a naturalness that still surprised her with how right it felt, and she leaned into him for exactly 3 seconds, which was long enough to mean something and short enough to preserve her dignity, and then she turned back inside to work. Henry bought the land a mile east of town in the late spring of 1884. He broke ground on the house foundation in June, and Maria helped him design it, not because he could not manage without her, but because the design problem genuinely interested her, and because the structural solutions she proposed were better than anything available locally. She designed a house with a full timber frame using mortise and tenon joinery throughout. No nails, no bolts in the primary frame, just the ancient technology of wood locked to wood under compression. The same principle her grandfather had understood when he built his first structure in this territory. The frame would last for generations. She told Henry this while drawing the plans on her drafting board, using the precise pencil technique her father had taught her. He watched her draw with the same attention he always gave to her work. "You are designing this for permanence," he said. "There is no other reason to design anything," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, will you marry me, Maria?" She looked up from the drafting board. He was standing across from her in the workshop, wearing the everyday expression of a man who has just said the truest thing he knows how to say, and is waiting for the response with the patient courage that is the only way to make yourself that vulnerable. She looked at him for a long moment, and she felt the full weight of the question and everything it represented, the permanence of it, the shared future of it, the choice it required her to make about the shape of her life, and she understood with the clarity of a person who knows their own mind that the answer had been available for some time, and she had simply been measuring the tolerance one last time. "Yes," she said, "on the condition that we are married here in this workshop, where we actually know each other." He smiled fully for one of the first times she had seen it complete. It was a very good smile. "Agreed," he said. They were married in July of 1884, in the workshop on a Saturday afternoon, with the doors open to the summer air and a small gathering of the people who mattered. The hotel owner came. Old man Guthrie came and brought his wife and stood in the back with a proprietary pride, as though he had arranged the whole thing. 3 families from the town came, the ones whose children sat at the school desk she had built and who brought her food when she was working late. The post rider came because Henry had asked him, and he had nothing better to do. The circuit preacher who passed through Ridgeline every 6 weeks happened to be passing through that particular Saturday, which they had planned around. He performed the ceremony in the same forthright manner. He performed all his obligations, efficiently and with genuine feeling. Maria wore a dress she had made from blue wool and her work boots, because she was not going to be married in uncomfortable shoes, and Henry wore his cleanest shirt and looked at her throughout the ceremony with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that she had to look away twice to keep her composure. They said their vows in plain language and meant every word. The summer and fall of 1884 were among the most productive and contented periods of Maria's professional life. With the Caldwell threat gone and the timber reserve available as a permanent backstop to her winter supply contracts, she took on commissions of a scope she had not previously been able to accept. She hired a young man from the valley, the 19-year-old son of one of the homesteader families, as a workshop apprentice, and began to teach him the craft with the same rigor her father had applied to her education. His name was Charlie Aldrich, and he was a patient and precise learner with good hands and a genuine curiosity about the properties of wood, and she found the teaching as satisfying as the making, which was something her father had told her she would discover when the time was right. Henry's freight operation expanded through the fall. He bought a 4th wagon and hired 2 additional drivers, and the Hawkins freight supply began to develop the regional reputation that justified his original instinct to establish in the San Juan basin. He hauled everything from mine ore to household goods to the building materials that followed the valley's continued growth, and he did it with the organizational efficiency and the honest dealing that made clients come back and recommend him to others. He also helped at the workshop when he was in town, which was often. He had become, over the months of working alongside Maria, a genuinely competent assistant in several woodworking tasks. Not a craftsman, he would have been the first to acknowledge that the level of skill she commanded was the product of a lifetime of practice that he had neither the background nor the time to replicate. but he understood the work, could prepare stock and set up operations and assist in the heavy moving, with the intelligence of someone who comprehended the purpose of each step. There was a particular afternoon in October, when the high country was turning gold, and the air carried the sharp clarity of the early autumn cold, when he was helping her move a large structural beam into position for final joinery. The beam was 12 feet long and 200 pounds, and the maneuver required precise coordination, because the mortise joint at the far end had to line up with the tenon on the post within a tolerance of 1/16 of an inch. "Ready?" she said, from the near end. "Ready," he said, from the far end. They moved together, and the beam settled into place with the particular solid sound of a well-fitted joint closing, a sound that she loved with the whole of her professional self. She went to the far end and checked the joint. Perfect. Henry looked at the ceiling joint and then at her, and she could see on his face the specific pleasure of a person who has participated in something excellent, even in a supporting role, and understands what they have been part of. "Every time," he said, "every single time you do that, I cannot believe how good you are." "I have been doing this since I was 6 years old," she said. "I know," he said. "That is not what I mean." She understood what he meant. By the winter of 1884, which was considerably milder than the previous one, Maria Monroe Hawkins was broadly acknowledged as the finest woodworker and structural timber specialist in the San Juan basin, which was a designation that was not given by proclamation, but accumulated through the evidence of standing structures and quality furniture, and the testimony of clients who knew what good work looked like. She was also, by December, pregnant with their first child. She told Henry on the 1st of December, in the workshop, in the same straightforward manner she applied to every important communication. He stood very still for a moment. Then he sat down on the nearest stool, which was not something she had seen him do abruptly before. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. "Approximately July, based on what I can calculate." He looked at her with an expression that was entirely new, layered and luminous, and slightly frightened in the way that people who love deeply are always frightened of what that love makes them capable of losing. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I intend to work through the spring, adjust the heavy lifting by the 4th month, and arrange for proper assistance by the summer. The workshop will not stop operating." "Of course not," he said, and his acceptance of this was immediate and complete, which was one of the 1,000 reasons she loved him. He stood up and came to her and held her with his arms around her and his face in her hair, and she let him, and in the stillness of the workshop she could feel the exact shape of everything they had built together in less than a year, and it was solid and true and hers. Their son was born in late July of 1885, during a summer storm that rattled the windows of the house Henry had built from her plans. Maria's labor was attended by the town midwife, a practical and unflappable woman named Vera Collins, who had delivered 30 babies in the valley, and treated each one as a normal event in a good day's work. Henry was in the outer room, not pacing but sitting very still with his hands clasped between his knees, and his expression that of a man who is accustomed to controlling his environment, and finds the inability to do so in this particular situation nearly unbearable. At just past midnight the baby cried, and the midwife came out and said, "You have a son, Mr. Hawkins, both doing well." Henry stood up so fast the chair scraped back across the floor. His son, his and Maria's son. They named him Thomas Ezra Hawkins, for her father and her grandfather, the men who had built the foundation she stood on. It was her choice, and Henry agreed to it immediately and completely, because he understood what those names meant and what they deserved to carry forward. Thomas was a large, healthy baby with his father's build and his mother's eyes, the dark, sharp, observant eyes of a person who looks at the world with attention. He grew through his first months with the uncomplicated vigor of a child who has come into a stable and loving environment, and both his parents watched him with the specific astonishment of people who had built their lives around making durable things, and found themselves utterly unprepared for the durability of love. Charlie Aldrich, the workshop apprentice, became in his second year a genuine craftsman in his own right, capable of managing the smaller commissions independently while Maria took on the complex and the structural. The workshop grew, not in size but in reputation, sending its output across the basin and beginning to receive inquiries from as far as Durango and Silverton. Henry's freight operation stretched to cover 3 counties by the spring of 1886, and he hired a manager in Durango to oversee the southern routes so that he could remain based in Ridgeland. He built a small freight yard at the edge of town with a proper stable and equipment barn, using the timber frame design principles Maria had applied to their house, and the building stood solid and square and was remarked upon by everyone who saw it. In the spring of 1887, when Thomas was nearly 2 years old and had developed the serious, focused expression that would be the defining feature of his face throughout his life, Maria discovered she was pregnant again. She told Henry in the workshop again, because the workshop was where the most important conversations of their life together took place, and his reaction was the same layered joy as before, deepened now by everything that had happened between the first announcement and this one. This pregnancy was harder, though she would not have said so unprompted. The winter of 1887 was difficult, one of the cold ones, and she was working in the shop when she should by strict accounting have been resting, and she was managing the household and the care of Thomas and the administrative side of the workshop business with her characteristic refusal to acknowledge limitation. Henry noticed. He noticed because he paid attention to her the way she paid attention to her timber, reading the grain, feeling the density, understanding the stress patterns. He adjusted without announcement, taking on more of the household management, spending his evenings in the workshop so she was not alone with the work, managing Thomas during the long hours with a father's ease that she found more moving than she had expected fatherhood to make of him. Their second child was born in October of 1887. A daughter this time, healthy and loud and dark-haired. They named her Alina, and she arrived in the world with a force of personality immediately apparent to everyone in the delivery room, including Vera Collins, who said she had never heard a newborn express its opinions so clearly. Henry held Alina on the first evening and looked at her with the expression of a man examining something he cannot entirely account for and is wholly grateful to have received. And Maria, exhausted and clear-eyed in the lamplight, watched him and felt the full extent of the life they had made. The years that followed were the years of building in the deepest sense, not just structures and enterprises, but the texture of a shared life. The workshop continued to produce work of the highest standard in the territory. The freight operation continued to expand. Thomas grew into a serious and methodical boy who showed, by the age of 5, an unmistakable interest in his mother's craft, sitting for hours on a low stool watching her work with the same focused attention Henry had shown on his first evening in the workshop. Alina grew into a fierce and voluble child who had opinions about everything and was afraid of nothing, which her parents found alternately delightful and exhausting. Maria made time, in the quiet evenings after the children were asleep and the workshop was dark, to go back up to the alcove in the canyon. Not often, perhaps 4 times in those years. She would go alone with a lantern and stand in the rock-arched space and put her hands on the timber her grandfather had placed and feel the connection between his work and her work and whatever her children would build in their own time. She told Henry about these visits. She told him everything. There was no part of her life that she withheld from him, not because the guarding of herself had disappeared, but because she had found in him the specific person with whom the guarding was unnecessary. On the 5th anniversary of their marriage, Henry arranged a surprise that demonstrated, she would later tell him, a better understanding of her than any gift of sentimental jewelry or domestic luxury could have. He hired the best available photographer in the territory, a man based in Durango who hauled his wet plate equipment up to Ridgeline on a specially built wagon, and he had the man photograph the workshop. All of it. The exterior with the sign she had hand-lettered herself. The interior with every tool in its place and the current commission on the bench. The cellar opening with the timber stacked below. The house with the timber frame visible at the gable end. And then he had the photographer photograph Maria at her workbench, the cabinet scraper in her hand, looking at the camera with the expression she always had when someone interrupted her work, which was focused and slightly impatient and completely herself. When she saw the photographs, developed and mounted on paper in the photographer's Durango studio and sent back in a flat case, she sat at the workbench for a long moment and looked at the image of herself and felt something that she did not have a word for in her working vocabulary. "You documented the workshop," she said. "The work deserves to be documented," he said. "So does the person who built it." She looked at him over the photograph. "Henry, Maria." She stood up and kissed him in the middle of the workshop, with Thomas watching from his low stool with the serious expression of a child who is not sure he understands what the adults are doing but is noting the data for future reference. "What is that for?" he asked, meaning Henry. "For being the right person," she said. "In the right place, at the right time." "I had a great deal of help from your grandfather," he said. She laughed. It was a full laugh, the kind she reserved for things that were genuinely, deeply amusing, and it filled the workshop and went out through the door into the summer afternoon. The reserve cash in the canyon sustained the workshop for 11 years before it was finally exhausted, in the spring of 1895. By then the workshop had established sufficient and diversified supply contracts that the exhaustion of the reserve was a milestone rather than a crisis, and Maria noted the day she removed the last piece of aged timber from the alcove with the quiet ceremony it deserved. She told Thomas about it that afternoon, because he was 13 by then and working in the workshop after school with the genuine skill of a child who had inherited 2 generations of craft understanding. She showed him the empty alcove, the cross rails where the timber had rested, the faded canvas remnants, the painted capstone still visible above the gap. "Your great-great-grandfather Ezra put this here," she said. "Your grandfather Thomas found it. I used it when I needed it most." Thomas looked at the empty space with the same focused attention he gave everything. "What do we do with it now?" She looked around the alcove. The arch of rock was beautiful in the lantern light, smooth and ancient and indifferent to the human drama that had played out around it. "We leave it as it is," she said, "and we remember what it means." "What does it mean?" "It means that the people who came before you thought about you, even when they could not have imagined you specifically." She paused. "And it means that the right preparation at the right time can change everything." He nodded slowly, the way his father nodded when he had genuinely absorbed something. She put her hand on the stone arch, the same rock her grandfather had seen, and felt the deep cold of it and the deep permanence, and then she picked up the lantern and led her son back down the canyon toward home. Eleanor at 12 was already showing the inclination that would define her, a ferocious interest in mathematics and the physical sciences, which she pursued with the same independence her mother had applied to woodworking, and her father had applied to his freight operation. She had no patience for anyone who told her what girls were suited for, which meant she had her mother's temperament applied to a different but equally unfashionable passion for a young woman in 1899. Maria told her what her father had told her, that the work was the work, and the question was never whether it was appropriate for you to do it, but only whether you could do it excellently. Eleanor took this instruction at face value and applied it with characteristic force. Henry was 48 in the year 1900, which was the year that the Hawkins Freight Supply was incorporated as a formal company with Henry as president and a board of 3 other Valley businessmen, representing a scale of operation that the man who had arrived on a dark roan gelding in the winter of 1884 would have found difficult to entirely imagine. He remained physically as formidable as ever, the hard work and the outdoor life maintaining the condition that had characterized him through all the years Maria had known him. And he moved through his middle age with the same unhurried competence that had first impressed her on the canyon trail. Maria was 40 at the same milestone year, and the workshop had by then the character of an institution rather than a sole operation, with 2 full craftsmen employed alongside Charlie Aldrich, who had become a partner in the enterprise and an excellent woodworker in his own right. She still made the finest and most complex pieces herself, still designed the structural systems that were her particular specialty, still went to the workshop in the earliest hours of the morning, when the light and the silence were exactly right for the kind of close work that required total attention. She had not become less in any dimension over the years. She had become more, which is what happens to people who do their work honestly and love the people they have chosen completely. On the morning of their 20th anniversary, Henry asked her to come with him to the canyon. She went, as she always went when he asked her something, with the willing attention of a person who has found that the person asking almost always has a good reason. He led her up the trail she knew as well as her own heartbeat, through the canyon mouth and along the main drainage and through the narrow passage to the secondary canyon and to the entrance of the alcove. He had been there before her. She could see the fresh boot prints in the early summer mud. Inside the alcove, in the empty space where Ezra Monroe's timber had rested for 23 years and where she had worked for 11 more, he had placed a single plank of wood, fresh cut, rough-shaped, the grain still open. On it, carved in a hand that was not a craftsman's but was deliberate and strong and patient, were the names Ezra Monroe, Thomas Monroe, Maria Monroe Hawkins. She stood and looked at it for a long time. "I asked Thomas to help me," Henry said from behind her. "He carved better than I can, but I did the planning and the layout." She ran her fingers over the carved letters. The depth of the cuts was even and controlled, the characteristic work of a boy who had been watching his mother do precise work since before he could speak. She turned around. Henry was standing in the narrow entrance gap, as he had stood 16 years ago with a struck match, looking at the extraordinary thing inside. "You made something," she said. "I made something," he agreed. "For you and for them." She crossed the space between them and put her hands on his chest and looked up at him with the same directness she had applied to every important thing in her life. 20 years, she said. 20 years, he agreed. "You have not once in 20 years tried to make me smaller." "The thought never occurred to me," he said. "There would have been nothing left worth having." She kissed him in the alcove of the canyon, with the rock arch above them and the summer air coming through the entrance gap, and the carved names of the people who had made her behind her, and it was the most specific and complete happiness she had ever felt. They walked back down the canyon in the late morning light, her hand in his, talking about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way people do when they have built a life together that is full enough to talk about indefinitely. The workshop was open when they got back to the house, which meant Thomas was there, and they could hear through the door the specific sound of a plane moving through wood, the long, clean stroke that meant the operator was comfortable and in control. Maria stopped and listened for a moment. Henry stopped beside her. "He has your touch," Henry said. "He has his own touch," she said. "It will be better than mine eventually." "You really believe that?" "I believe that is what children are for," she said. "To be better than you were." She pushed the workshop door open, and the smell of cedar and pine shavings came out to meet her like a greeting, like a homecoming, like the most fundamental thing she knew about the world. And she stepped inside to the work that had always been hers and always would be, with the man she loved in the doorway and the voice of her son at the bench, and the mountains above the canyon holding everything in their cold and permanent embrace. Outside, the San Juan range stood as it had always stood, indifferent and magnificent, keeping its secrets and yielding them only to those who knew where to look and had the courage and the preparation to look properly. And in the alcove in the secondary canyon, carved in good wood by careful hands, the names held their place in the dark and the cold and the quiet, a record of the people who had found, in the hardest seasons, exactly what they needed: